Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Before we hear from our speaker today, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves real quick around the room. I'll begin. My name is Roy.
Ricky, Douglas.
My name's Amos.
I'm John.
Adam.
Dale.
Patrick. Lee. Jerry.
Roseanne. Dar.
Chris.
Joe. My name is Harley.
Fabrizio.
David. Jack.
David. My name is Paige.
Jeff.
Doug.
Jay.
My name is Joe.
My name is David.
My name is Mark.
And Paul.
Peter. My name is Jim.
Mitch.
Hawthorne.
I'm Jerry.
I think that's everyone. Our speaker today is Dale Borglum. Dale is the founder and executive director of the Living Dying Project. He's a pioneer in the conscious dying movement and has worked directly with thousands of people with life-threatening illness and their families for over 30 years. In 1981, Dale founded the first residential facility for people who wish to die consciously in the United States, the Dying Center. He has taught and lectured extensively on the topics of spiritual support for those with life-threatening illness, caregiving as a spiritual practice, and healing at the edge of illness, of death, of loss, of crisis. Dale has a BS from UC Berkeley and a PhD from Stanford University. He's the co-author of Journey of Awakening, a meditator's guidebook, and has taught meditation for the past 35 years. Welcome, Dale.
Thank you very much. Today I would like to talk about preparing for death, a topic suggested to me last time I was here. And in terms of meditative practice, the best preparation for death is realizing the deathless. But let's start out by first talking about what happens when you die so we know what we're preparing for. I'm going to tell you what happens after you die. After you die physically during the spiritual dying process. And you might very reasonably ask, well, how the hell does he know? He doesn't look like any more a product of the after-death experience than anybody else in the room. And that would be a very good question. All I can say is I've been around an awful lot of dying people. I've plunged deeply into meditation, but mostly I've been around some of the greatest spiritual masters of the 20th century who said things about living and dying, and what they said about living have all seemed to be true. And pretty much what they said about dying is consistent, so I'm going to summarize that. And what they say goes beyond differences that arise culturally and differences that arise in relation to how long ago people said these things. So here's my version of what happens after one physically dies. And in this talk, I'll be using the word dying both in the physical sense and in the spiritual sense. Physical dying takes place in just a minute or two when the heart and the brain stop functioning. The spiritual dying process takes place over often several days. That begins before one physically dies and continues after one physically dies. And in fact, the reason that we're even looking at this as a topic here in a Buddhist meditation group is that almost all contemplative spiritual traditions, certainly the Buddhist ones, say that this dying process is the most auspicious, opportune time in an extended lifetime in which to realize one's Buddha nature, one's true nature. Right now, strange as it seems, you and I are enlightened. There is nothing that we have to find that we don't have already. But because of our incredibly strong identification with body and personality, it seems like I'm talking to you. There's a bunch of people in this room with different kinds of bodies and personalities, older, younger, bigger, smaller, more hair, less hair. And yes, certainly in that dimension of personhood, you will die and I will die. But these contemplative traditions say very, very clearly that there is a dimension, a very, very real dimension of who we are that is deathless, that does not die. Stephen Levine, who I used to teach with, a very dear friend of mine, wrote a book, Who Dies? The whole book is contained in that title, the question, who is it that dies? So in looking around the room and seeing those differences, in that dimension, our bodies die, our personalities die. Is it possible right now, actually, to look around the room and see that which does not die? Not so easy. But can we see with a different set of eyes, hear with a different set of ears, that which does not change moment to moment? Buddhism talks a lot about impermanence. The impermanent dies. What is permanent? What is unchanging? In the moments when I'm speaking, there's sound in the room. When I stop speaking, there's at least not the sound of my voice, but awareness continues. So we'll get to that a little bit later. What is it that really doesn't die? Going back now to this interesting tale of what happens when you die. First, we will explore the near-death experience, because that is the first part of the dying experience. And there is an incredible amount of consistency in the reports of people who have had near-death experiences and come back and talk about it. And what they say is pretty much like this. I was in this automobile accident, or I was on this operating table, or I had this heart attack. Something happened, and I physiologically died. But I didn't feel any sense of crisis or difficulty. My consciousness left my body. I was aware that my body was lying there, and I was even a bit confused as to why the emergency medical people were treating this as such a big deal, because to me it seemed like everything was fine. I experienced a great deal of integrity and safety and wholeness, so much so that if my body had been ripped and crunched a bit in an accident, say, and was writhing in physical pain, the consciousness was not experiencing that physical pain. Or if the body had ingested a great deal of narcotics because, say, of cancer pain, the consciousness was not affected by those drugs. Even if this body had been blind all of its life, during the near-death experience, the consciousness could see what was going on in the room, could see what color clothes the people had on in the room. And even beyond that, there are cases where somebody is in an operating room, say on the third floor of a hospital, and they clinically die on the operating table. Their consciousness drifts away from their body, watches what's going on, and then for some reason they kind of go up to the fifth floor and they're drawn to room 523 where there's a patient in a coma who can't speak. And the patient in the coma tells the consciousness of the person that's died, these doctors just don't know what's going on. What I need to tell them is such and such is going on in me. And lo and behold, the person down in the operating room doesn't die. Consciousness comes back into their body. They reawaken. They become conscious. And they say, you ought to go up to room 523 because what that patient needs is such and such. And lo and behold, that's exactly what that patient needed. And the tests up until that point had not really figured that out. So what does that say about consciousness? I mean, we could hypothesize here, but it seems that consciousness may be a little more complicated, a little more subtle, a little more fantastic and beautiful than we often assume in our day-to-day going about things. So here's this person that's having this near-death experience, and after a short amount of time, their consciousness is attracted toward what is universally described as a very bright and beautiful light. Never a great sound or a great smell. It's always a light. Sometimes there's a tunnel. Sometimes there are guides of departed loved ones. But there's always this light. The consciousness goes up to this light, but because it's only a near-death experience, for reasons which a sophisticated group like us can call karma, realizes that it's not time to fully merge into the light, comes up to the light, doesn't merge into it, and then goes back into the physical body. The body becomes conscious, and the person says something like, I've had the most remarkable experience. I'm no longer afraid of dying the way that I used to be, and you don't need to be either. I'm sure almost everyone here has heard stories roughly like what I have just recounted. Now, there is a New Age exaggeration or slight mistake here. Robert Bly pronounces New Age newage to rhyme with sewage for some reason. We don't quite know why. But anyway, the New Age says something like, here's this near-death experience. We don't have to be afraid of dying. Death is completely safe, isn't it? This person almost died, and they come back and say that death is safe. Now, death is safe to the consciousness that was out of the body and was up there with the light. But then what happens, the consciousness comes back into the body and says, I'm this body, and dying is safe. Well, dying could not be more unsafe to your body or your personality. So we have to really be clear what we're talking about here when we're using the word safe. Okay, now somebody actually dies, and the first part of the process is the same. Consciousness leaves the body. There's the sense of wholeness and integrity. Not a problem, pain, drugs, whatever might be going on. Maybe there's people pounding on your chest, strangers you've never met before, ripping your your shirt open on your chest, and there you are in a public place. People are doing all these strange things to you. It's not bothering the consciousness at all. Consciousness dies. This time, it goes to the light, and because it's not a near-death experience, it merges completely into that light. One becomes enlightened. One of the first things that happens after you die is you become enlightened. Now, usually when we talk about spiritual practice, we talk about compassion for our suffering and working with the difficult things that prevent us from being fully present. Very rarely, particularly in Buddhism, but very rarely do we talk about the other side of the coin. One can love exactly as much as one is able to suffer. One can bear suffering only as much as one is willing to love. So there are really two parallel spiritual tracks. One of them is how much love, light, joy can you bear? And the other is how clearly and compassionately can you deal with the suffering that is in and around each of us? So if in your lifetime, when the light arises, which it's doing all of the time, but it's particularly evident at certain moments when there is that favorite piece of music, or you're looking into the eyes of a beloved, or there's this pure child, or you're out in nature, or you're having some intimate encounter with somebody, whatever it might be. But I'm sure all of us many times have gone into that experience of light, this experience of love. But isn't it the case that often, rather quickly, the light becomes too bright? And there you are hearing this perfect piece of music that's just sending you into ecstasy, and all of a sudden you're thinking about, what am I going to do after the concert? What's for lunch? Or you're really loving this other human being, and then you notice they've got a little pimple on their cheek or something like that, right? So as we learn to bear suffering, can we also learn to bear being in the light? The Buddhists say, the Tibetan Buddhists say, that as you die, this light that you're attracted to is as bright as 1,000 suns. That's pretty bright. So if you have not practiced in your lifetime resting in the light, whatever that means to you, resting in that light, being that light, not only seeing it outside, but admitting that you, I, are that light, then the light is going to be too bright. And we have this enlightenment experience after we die, but we recoil from that. It's too much. So the Tibetans say that this first experience after you die of merging into the light is the most opportune time to realize your true nature. That light is right now in this room, just as bright as after you die. But we're so embedded in this illusion of identification with body and personality that that is all that we are, that it is incredibly difficult to open up to the extent of that light right now as we sit here talking and listening. So what happens then, if you don't rest in the light, what's preventing you from resting there is projected outward. Your hopes, fears, and desires that you are still identified with, this you that's been localized in time and space, now begins to let go, dissolve, and you can react to that. So here is another possibility of realizing your true nature by watching your relationship with these hopes and fears as they're being let go of. And let me give you a couple of rather instructive and hopefully slightly humorous examples to say what I'm talking about, explain what I'm talking about. You don't have a body anymore, but part of your psychological makeup is fear for your body. Everybody wants to protect their bodies. It's a very strong drive. So you've died, and right behind you, after you've been in the light, you hear this incredibly ferocious, angry, snarling, wild animal. It sounds like the angriest dog you've ever heard that wants to bite your head off. Now, there's no angry, snarling dog in the after-death state, but there is fear for your body in you. So as this fear arises, do you realize, oh, that's just fear. I've been in the light. I mean, I've just been enlightened. Why do I have to unconsciously react to that? I can just let that go. If you just let that go, you've just saved 3 lifetimes of psychotherapy and body work. But if you unconsciously, compulsively react to that and pull back from that fear, that unconscious reaction causes karma, as it does right now. It creates the next becoming. Okay, that was example number 1. Example number 2, you've died and you still feel there's something you're holding on to that I'm incomplete. If I had the the perfect partner, I would then be happier. And there you are, you've died, and walking in front of you, right through your field of vision, is the perfect person. Intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, sexually, financially, every way you can think of. The most attractive in every dimension. Not just this great person, but the perfect projection of your desire to be met is there in front of you. So do you realize that just my desires, I can just let go of that, karma gone, or do you go trotting over to this person and say, I'm kind of busy dying right now, but could I get your phone number so when I'm done with this, we can really do that thing? Okay. So these are slightly humorous examples, but you hear what I'm saying. And we have that potential to train for that moment right now, in each moment of our lives. When there are things that we want to grasp, like that perfect being, or things that we want to resist and pull away from, we have the chance to work with those in the way that contemplative traditions, Buddhism, teaches us to, again and again, with awareness and compassion, work with the stuff of our lives. Just as a provocative example, the first person I ever worked with was a young man named Chris who had moved to Santa Cruz from Toronto. He was in his late 20s. He was a radio engineer for the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and for some reason that he didn't even understand himself, he decided to move to Santa Cruz back in the late 1970s. And Stephen Levine and I were teaching a Tuesday night meditation group that Chris started coming to, and it was clear that he was really not well. He had fairly advanced leukemia. This meditation group kind of coalesced around Chris and actually became the genesis of the Hospice of Santa Cruz. But a bunch of us were taking care of Chris as he was approaching death. Now, because he was a 28-year-old male, and he was getting weaker and weaker and weaker, he was becoming sexually frustrated. He couldn't even get out of bed. And it really bothered him that he didn't have a sexual identity anymore. I was with him through the night, the two of us alone, the night before he died the next morning. He died about 9 or 10 in the morning. It was the middle of the night. Chris had not spoken for a couple of days. He was in a light comatose state, it seemed. He would move a little bit, but he was not communicating. It was clear that he didn't have much time left before he was going to leave his body. Middle of the night, I'm sitting there meditating, and I hear him moving a bit. I look. He's opened up his eyes, and he's looking up toward the ceiling with a look of rapture on his face. And I thought, he's seeing the heavenly host come to greet him. They're playing their harps. He's about to die. I said, Chris, what do you see? And he said, beautiful women wherever I look. And those were the last words that man ever spoke. So that when he died then, about 5 hours later, and Stephen was at his bedside, Stephen said, Chris, if you see beautiful women as you're dying, realize it's only a projection of your mind. And you don't need to get caught in that projection. Just trust the love and the wisdom and the compassion that you have generated in this lifetime. And whatever is that arises, particularly these images of sexual attraction, realize it's only your mind. And it felt like those words penetrated deeply into his heart. Sometimes, you've talked to somebody, you can feel your words kind of bouncing off of them. And sometimes the words go in an inch, and sometimes the words go right in. And it felt like, to my view at that point, that Chris really heard that and that he died very, very well. So that's the next second best opportunity in which to realize your nature. So you've had this big advantage that you've just been in the light. But it's not just a small yapping dog. It's the full extent of your fear. It's not just an attractive person. It's a full extent of your desire. So you've got this experience of, I've just been in the light, but here are your strongest fears and desires, the full extent of them being there. We have each created very perfectly a personality to avoid, as best as we can, feeling the depth of our fear and the depth of our need, so that we can have a life where we experience entertainment and happiness with friends and are able to make a living, and we can sleep at night. And when we wake up in the middle of the night, it might be a little scary, but it's not the full extent of that fear that's been shoved down deep, deep, deep inside of us ever since we were probably too young to speak. That will be there as you're dying. Now is the moment, now is the opportunity to begin to work with those qualities as directly and compassionately as humanly possible. So one can use meditation, and it's often received and often even taught in this way. One can use meditation to quiet the mind, to become happier, to even begin to learn to do what's called a spiritual bypass, to get spiritual enough that you're not really feeling that stuff that you push down inside. But is it possible to use meditation in a different way? And this is what I've been trying to do in my own life and teach in those groups that piece of paper out there is about. That when you're meditating, patterns will appear. And rather than just coming right back to the breath or whatever it is you're doing, can you begin to open up to what that pattern feels like in your emotional body and your physical body? For instance, when I was really young, I had a couple of pretty severe electrical shocks. When I was 9 months old and 3 years old, both times I got a really strong electrical shock by putting hairpins in electrical outlets and forks and toasters and things. So I learned at a very early age that by following my curiosity and just doing what seems like the natural thing to do, I could almost get dead. And that the world was not at all a safe place. So I developed a personality where I was planning, looking at, is it safe? What can I do to make the world safer? And I did Vipassana and Zen for about 20 years and kept having planning thoughts. I'd noticed these planning thoughts for 20 years. If the retreat was long enough, they'd calm down. I'd get really concentrated. The teacher would say, "Good, Dale, you're doing great." But the retreat was over. I'd go out into the world. There'd be dangerous things out there. And those patterns would continue. And I'd try to meditate them away, which I was relatively successful at temporarily. But finally, I had some crises in my life that were strong enough that I couldn't really meditate them away. And I realized that there was a message from that pattern, and that there was this part of me that was screaming out for compassion. So that rather than meditating away this unsafe place, could I then begin to embrace, have compassion for, open to that place that I'd been pushing away for so very long? And actually, in that way, healing the places in myself that would make it that much more difficult to rest in the light when I was actually leaving my body. Okay, so we've only got about 15 more minutes. We can talk about the path that brings you there, which I've talked about briefly in my other 2 Sunday mornings here at the Gay Buddhist Fellowship. But let's just take a breath here and see, are there any questions or remarks about what I've just said? Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, a lot of what you're talking about is the human experience, and my constant companion these days is my dog. Do dogs have similar issues?
I'm sorry, did you say, do dogs have similar issues?
Similar issues with death, with going to the light, and other, I mean, this is very human-centric, what you're talking about, seems to me.
I have never helped a dog die, and consciousness is consciousness. According to some schools of Buddhism, souls, whatever those are, go through incarnations to get to being human, and dogs and other animals are part of that process. I really, myself, and you'll have to pardon me if this isn't a very adequate response to your question, but I tend to focus on what can help me and the people I'm working with get free. Ramana Maharshi, a very great Indian sage, had a cow that he claimed was enlightened. And I'm sure there are people that feel that their dogs or their cats are very, very high beings. So maybe this soul is taking an incarnation as your dog or somebody else's cat or somebody else's cow as a way of working through a piece of karma. I don't know how I would, I'm more of a cat person than a dog person. Please forgive me. But I've had cats teach me a great deal. And I did one time live with a golden retriever in the mountains of New Mexico, just the two of us for a long time. And he was a very, very high being. So I'm kind of dancing around your question. But my sense is that whether the consciousness is dog consciousness or person consciousness, the question, the process is relatively the same. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much.
Okay. You first.
Quick question. I've been with someone who is went into sort of the dying process, breathing slowly and all that. But this person had meditation and some spiritual growth. But then quite right before they passed away, we were breathing and I was giving support and warmth and all that. All of a sudden, she stood up in the bed, sat up, eyes bright, breathing heavy for the last 60 seconds and then laid back. What is that all about? Some say the death rattle, and then
the death rattle is a certain way of breathing,
there
actually.
was a surge of energy for the last moments of life. Do you know?
I don't know.
Have you seen that?
I've seen people who were getting more and more and more weak and unable to speak or move, and right at the end they'd open up their eyes. Sometimes they'd sit up. My guess is that the experience of the consciousness leaving the body or preparing to leave the body is a very major, profound thing. And the body is incredibly intelligent. The mind is very manipulative. The mind will say, I don't want to... people come to me and say, I don't want to die. Could you help me stay alive? I'll do anything to stay alive. And it seems, though, that their body is dying. It feels like they're moving toward dying. And yet, when I really explore what's going on, it seems that here is a person who has a worldview that it's not okay to accept death. Like Dylan Thomas, fight, whatever. What was his?
Do not go gently into that.
Yeah. Do not go gently into that dark night. So somebody knows they're dying, their body knows they're dying, but the mind is saying, I don't want to die, it's not time to die. On the other hand, there are other people saying, I want to die, help me die. And it doesn't seem like the body is dying. And if you really talk to them, they're afraid they're becoming an emotional, financial burden on the people that are taking care of them. And they don't really want to die, but their personality is such that it's almost worse to be a burden and to be ashamed and embarrassed by being a burden than it is to die. So they're saying, I'd rather die than be a burden. And when you really talk to them and get the caregivers to say what an honor it is to be caring for them, then often this person says, you're right, I don't want to die, let's work with that for a while. So what this person exactly experienced, I don't know. But once again, it shows us that consciousness is quite mysterious, and that I can't say more than that. I'm sorry. In the back.
Hi. I'm really struggling with how anybody can know, either in an intellectual way or some other way of knowing what happens after the brain stops.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you seem to kind of describe something after the brain stops.
Right.
But how would anybody know?
Well, how would anybody know what happens after the brain stops? And there are particularly Tibetan Buddhists who have been trained to go into that state with people and come back and report and can stop their brain and go off in these states. Point number one. Point number two, this guy Eben Alexander wrote a book called, what's the name of the book? Somebody knows the book? Heaven something. There's a whole cover article about him on Time magazine about 9 months ago. He was a neuroscientist who had a rare form of meningitis, and because he was a neuroscientist, he was a doctor, he got state-of-the-art medical care. They hooked him up to all these brain monitors, and his prefrontal cortex stopped operating for about a week. And during this time, he had this experience of dying and going to heaven. And then came back, and he had some miraculous recovery, and they awakened him, and he reported all this stuff. And yet, it couldn't... Before then, a lot of doctors were feeling that all these near-death experiences are really only the brain being deprived of oxygen, and the chemical biochemistry is getting out of whack, so people are having hallucinations or something like that. But here's this guy whose prefrontal cortex had no activity and was having all these experiences outside of his body. He went up to heaven, and he came back and he said, there's only 3 or 4 things you've got to know. You're always loved. You're protected. You can't do anything wrong, and something else like that. It's all good, and there's the Holocaust, and there's AIDS, and there's different things like that. But basically, in the larger scheme of things, he's saying that there is this place. There's pink clouds there, and all stuff like that. So. Somebody once asked the Buddha, does reincarnation exist? And he said, well, if it existed, how would that affect your life? And the questioner said, well, because I would want to have a better next life, I would meditate a lot, I would study the scriptures, and I'd be an all-around nice guy. And the Buddha said, well, if reincarnation didn't exist, how would you live? And the guy said, well, because this would be my only opportunity, I would really meditate and study the scriptures and be an all-around nice guy. And the Buddha said, just so, it doesn't really make any difference. What do you need to know to live this moment of your life most fully and completely and with the most love? And what's interesting about this story, whether it's true or not, is that there are no special qualities or talents you need to learn to die well. Exactly the qualities that I'm sure you talk about in your meetings when we're not talking about dying. Clear awareness, generosity, compassion, wisdom are the qualities that will help you die well. So that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question. But in a way, they don't speak to the heart of what do we take from the fact we're going to die, and that we are this twofold consciousness of this personhood that's impermanent, it's going to die, and there's this deathless quality that we really haven't gotten a chance to talk about too much, that doesn't die. Yes?
I was just curious if this neurosurgeon, if you know, was a Christian before he went to heaven in his mind, or was he?
I don't think he was. I think he was.
Non-believer.
I think he was pretty much just a scientist.
Just a scientist, and he experienced God. Okay, that's all I wanted to know.
I just want to thank you for your talk. I'm really captivated. It flows really easy for me to understand you. But I'm not certain about something you said about there's an illusion of identification with body and personality. And I was just wondering if one would have more of a contemplative lifestyle, would we be maybe a bit more ready to die and not be so fearful of death, which I think our culture really has a problem with?
Yes.
Great.
So, right now here in the Bay Area, there are these teachers like Adyashanti and Gangaji and Eckhart Tolle, doesn't really live here, but people who talk about non-duality. Advaita Vedanta, Mahamudra, Dzogchen. And what's really being said is that after dualistic practice, after the hopefully the goal and ultimate result of a contemplative life is going beyond I am contemplating my breath, or I am contemplating the truth of the universe, and the I begins to dissolve. The identification with I'm just, certainly you still have a body and a personality, but you also have experiences of resting in pure awareness. And this pure awareness does not die. Consciousness does not die. And in fact, your consciousness and my consciousness and our consciousness are one consciousness. It's not even that we're connected, but we are one at that level. And that level is the level where we are deathless. So the more, though, you do contemplative practice, the more you meditate and become non-reactive to here's a pleasant thing, here's an unpleasant thing, and we're busy pushing and pulling in relationship to each experience that arises, then this resting in awareness is something that begins to unfold naturally and spontaneously. Jim.
I'm loving this talk. Thank you very much. In the 5 or 6 times in my life where I've had trivet falls and skiing and falling down a mountain on acid, various near physical accidents, things have gotten extremely slow and calm and spacious in the midst of this, as if somehow my being knew that I was in a potentially fatal circumstance. I had all the time in the world to devise a strategy about what I might grab onto, or that I should relax. And, that seems to be incredibly insightful for a desperate moment that it should, from a conscious point of view, so enlarge. Is that somehow connected to the skill of dying, or there's this innate sense that we know how to die if we would not get so hysterical about it?
You guys sure have a collection of questions here today. I almost never say I don't know. I'm somebody who always thinks he knows, and you're really I've been fascinated with the idea of time, and we really don't have time to get into that. But there is an equation in physics that connects time and space. The slower time gets, the bigger space gets. The faster time gets, the smaller space gets. And almost all Buddhist meditations talk about becoming more spacious. But in Asia, there's not a lot of space. It's crowded. So a lot of these meditations are, let's create more space. But in the West, almost everybody has a backyard in your own bedroom, and you've got space. I've got space. I live in Marin. Maybe I have more space than you. I don't know. But we don't have much time. So you can translate these spaciousness meditations to slowing down meditations. And as you're sitting, notice when time starts speeding up. Or when you're living, notice when time starts speeding up. And that's saying that you're losing that contact with spaciousness, which is the nature of the compassionate heart.
We have time for one more question. Let's go for it.
Yes.
So you were talking about living your life, always planning to be safe, and you would spend limited amounts of time meditating and maybe kind of lose that planning, but you'd go back into life, and there it would be you're always planning to push away whatever dangers might be present or whatever it is that might cause death or something. But then you realize in your meditation, instead of pushing away or planning, you would go there. Or you would go to that place of whatever it is you were trying to plan against. And I'm not understanding what it is you were going towards instead of planning.
Okay. So once again, this is going to have to be a very short answer that could be a lot longer if we had time. So I begin to notice that there are a lot of planning thoughts when I'm meditating. And I can suppress them because I've meditated a long time and I have trained my mind to do that. But then they come back again, and I can suppress them, and then they come back again. But then I said, well, why do they keep coming back? And then I started thinking about the shocks and my life and this and that. So what I started doing is doing compassion practice for the part of myself that didn't feel safe. As an adult, or as a 9-month-old, or as a 3-year-old, I picture that person in front of me and do a practice called taking and sending, or Tonglen, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. Pema Chodron talks about it a lot. It's described on the Living Dying Project website, my website, livingdying.org. There's a couple of articles about it. So I would begin to, instead of, this is so tricky, that I said before, we've created this personality to avoid what's most difficult. And that personality is helping you run your meditation practice. And in fact, it's very instrumental in saying, here's what you should do next. So the part of yourself that you really need to look at is the part of yourself that's saying, don't look at me, let's look over there. So, but life has this wonderful, perfect way of saying, you're not going to get away with that. I'm going to keep showing you these places. Okay, so it keeps coming up, and then eventually you see this pattern, you become aware of it. The next stage is, can I have compassion? Can I embrace that part of myself, the place that feels unsafe, that I'm trying to avoid because it's so profoundly uncomfortable? So instead of just pushing it away and going back to my breath, can I love that little boy that got scared when he got thrown across the room by putting the fork in the toaster, whatever it might be? Okay. And we each have our own fork in the toaster. We each have that place that's almost unbearable. And it's probably why you're in this room. It's probably why you meditate in the first place, because you're trying to make that go away. You're trying to not feel that. There is no shortcut other than going right through it. There's no end run or detour. And what happens in a lot of people's meditation practices, it deepens to a point where you get pretty good at it, but then there is this core wound or these deeper places. And you don't have the courage, you don't have the support to confront those places directly. So your practice starts getting stale. We're going on detours, we're hitting roadblocks. But only through love can we get through those places. The mind creates the abyss, the heart crosses the abyss. So only then by bringing in a true compassion for this place that has been almost unbearable does true healing happen. True healing happens through contact with the sacred. And the sacred is loving what is there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, announcements.
I'm your host. Welcome. Please stay and enjoy the conviviality of the community. We have tea. There's some treats from Safeway's cookie department, and there's some fruit out there. And I'll be around with the Donna Bowl. We suggest $5 or stratospherically above that, depending on your mood. A bunch of people may gather at the door around 12:30 to go out for lunch and feel welcome to join them. There's a sign-up sheet if you want to get on our mailing list. It's out by the Donna Bowl on this right counter. If you use a teacup, please put it at the sink, and I will wash them at the end of the morning. And I think that's it. Am I forgetting? Anyway, also, next week, our beloved Harley Shapiro is going to give a slideshow and travel presentation about his recent trip to Buddhist landmarks in Southeast Asia. So, do you want to add a little more?
Well, it'll be colorful. And yeah, I'm going to be visiting Bodh Gaya and Sarnath in India, and also some Chinese Buddhist festival in Kuching in Borneo, and in Penang, some things, as well as another sacred the gay and lesbian and queer Pride Parade in Bangalore, South India, which is a very spiritual event. And also the next day was the AIDS Day in Bangalore, and I have some incredible photographs and images and feelings.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.